Good afternoon. On behalf of the Ethics and Conduct Committee of the American Society of Cytopathology, I would like to welcome you all to our discussion today on why conflict of interest is important in science and medicine. In our panel here today, we have Dr. Barbara Crothers, past president of the American Society of Cytopathology and current chair of the Ethics and Conduct Committee of the ASC. We have Dr. Alae Kawam, who is a PGY3 anatomic pathology and clinical pathology resident at Northwell Health Pathology in New York. And we have Dr. Ramon Jackson, who is a PGY1 resident in Northwell Pathology in New York as well. My name is Dr. Rubina Cocker. I'm an associate professor at the Northwell Health Pathology Department, and I am also the moderator of today's meeting. So we will now look at our conflicts of interest, and Drs. Kawam, Jackson, and myself do not have any conflicts of interest. Dr. Crothers also serves on committees of the College of American Pathologists. So let's go straight on into our discussion today, and let's talk about what conflict of interest really is. So, as you can see, it is having a duty or loyalty to more than one entity, including oneself, with the potential to exploit decision-making or actions to favor one over the other. So at this point, I'm going to turn to Dr. Crothers. And my question is, Dr. Crothers, have you ever had a situation where you've been involved in something that was a conflict of interest? And if so, how did you handle it?
Certainly, thank you. I think most of us have been involved in conflicts of interest. A specific situation that comes to mind is when I was chair of a professional committee, and I noticed during one of our meetings that one of the committee members was working on a project that was from another organization. And I felt very uncomfortable about that at the time because I recognized that the individual wasn't giving the full attention to our meeting that was deserved. So at lunchtime, I mentioned it to the individual, and needless to say, that activity stopped. Now, I don't really think the individual recognized that there were competing loyalties to two different organizations and that it wasn't fair to our organization for that person to be doing work for another on our time. But there was really no harm done to our committee members, even though that was the case. So in my situation, as you see, there doesn't really necessarily have to be an adverse outcome in order to have a conflict of interest. But having that conflict imposes a moral judgment on us to act appropriately and to align our duties appropriately as well. So conflict actually allows us to use our influence, relationships, or our money to influence an outcome. And this can be subconscious or conscious. As physicians, our first duty is always to the patient or the public because they expect us to be acting in their best interest first. And sometimes as professional organizations, we have our own goals and we have to come back to asking ourselves whether what we're doing is in the best interest of the public and the patient, or is it in our own best interest that we've been acting.
Thank you so much. We are now going to watch a scenario played out and determine if the conflict of interest was handled appropriately. Let's watch.
Hi, I'm Dr. Wavelength. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright and Dr. Greenville, for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking your time out of your day. It looks like you're working from home, Dr. Wright. And Dr. Greenville, thanks for staying late to meet with me today. So
you're very welcome.
So like I mentioned, it's Dr. Wavelength here, and I am here from Photonomics selling you guys, or like to pitch to you guys, our new SpectraVid, which is a brand new coronavirus diagnostic tool that uses a special technology to diagnose COVID. And the way it works is that it only uses a probe that goes near the patient's throat to give you a result in 30 seconds or less. And our new product uses the special erythema that happens in patients' throats, and it detects that special that special color that happens on patients' throats, and gives a diagnosis from there. And a lot of things, there's a lot of stuff out there on the market, like the nasal swabs and things like that, and antibody testing, which have high false positive rates. Ours has a near zero false positive rate. The other thing that happens with our product is that there is no discomfort. You're not going in with a nasal swab, somebody's wriggling around or anything like that. It's just diagnostic, just near the throat. So you don't have to worry about any of those high false negative rates as well, where you don't really get the sample properly. So our product is the best on the market right now.
It sounds very neat. Awesome. What do you think?
I have to agree, Dr. Wavelength. The stuff, all of the information that your assistant sent over was fantastic. We have no issues with the efficacy of your test. Your trials results were great. The one thing that I kind of found was missing from all of the data that she sent was the pricing. We're on a budget.
So each test runs about $15 per test, which considering the really superior quality of this product is very cheap.
I think that sounds reasonable. I mean, $15 for a large company like ours. I think, Dr. Wright, don't you think?
Well, I do agree that it is a good price. However, we have to think about the volume that we're going to go through. We are testing people, and every day they're filling out these questionnaires, whether they have a stuffy nose or a headache, and we're going through these tests at an astronomical rate, and this is going to build up quickly. So do you think maybe there's any wiggle room for the price of this test?
So considering how high demand our product is and how superior it is, we're actually going to stick to this price of $15.
Really? Have you got any other, what's your market been like? Have you been able to sell this to other larger institutions like ours?
Larger institutions jump on our product. They do not want other people, to have it and they not have it. So it is competitive in large institutions.
There you go, Dr. Wright.
We're selling to everyone. Everyone who we pitch to likes to have some.
The question about how great of a product and the company. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the
Photonomics. It's Photonomics. You're not familiar with it?
I don't know that I've heard of it.
Yeah, I've done some business there. I've invested with them. They're pretty good. Very, very, everything is like neatly tied up. They do their job, they do their business. It's very, very clean. It's a very clean company. I would invest with it. And I would really give them the $15 because I think it's peanuts compared to the we're a large institution. You want to be competitive at the end of the day, don't you?
I totally agree, but I think I need to just pause and draw some attention to the clear conflict of interest we have here.
I don't see a conflict of interest. What do you mean?
Well, we're determining whether or not we are going to spend a sizable portion of our budget on a very expensive test that is not willing to work with us for the pricing. And one of the people helping to make this decision has a financial incentive with this company if you own stock in it.
But, I'm not thinking about my own financial, interest here. I'm thinking more about patient-centered care. I mean, think about it. How many people are dying? It's now like 4,000 a day. I mean, are you going to look at somebody's interests, or are you going to look at the fact that we need to save lives? And you can't wait for a vaccine that's still not there. You can't wait for a test that takes 2 weeks to come back. In the best case scenario, 24 hours to 48, and even then a false negative can happen. So I think we're onto something great here.
I want to agree with you. The problem I'm worried about how this looks. I have to be honest with you, Dr. Greenbill. This is going to raise some eyebrows when we agree to pay for this test. If it is a publicly traded company and it becomes known that you have financial incentive in the company, maybe we should consider either taking a pause to discuss legal implications with this decision. I do understand that it's a great product. However, I was unaware of this clear conflict of interest. We are going to have to get this cleared in the legal department to make sure that there is no error in your decision or bias towards this company strictly because of your stock financial relationship with them. That, I mean, do we all? I mean, Dr. Wade, that I hate that we hate to appear that we've wasted your time, but what do you think? Do you kind of say this might be a bit of an issue?
I think the best thing is to stop here and give you some time to think about our product. And I really appreciate you guys' time, taking out time of your day to meet with me. So I'm going to give you guys some time. All righty? Nice to meet with you guys.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think you have something here.
Thank you so much.
I do too. And we will be back with you, but we would just like to make sure that there is a clear conflict of interest that we will have to address, and we will be with you as soon as we can get this worked out.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for meeting.
Thank you. I'm sorry
for your time.
Well, I hope you all found that not only entertaining, but also thought-provoking. So I guess what's going on in our heads is, what is the conflict of interest here, and who are the conflicted parties? Was disclosure of the conflict open and evident to all parties? Was it handled appropriately? What are some other ways to mitigate the conflict? And what are the potential adverse outcomes if the institution did indeed purchase the test? So we're going to turn now to our expert panel. Dr. Jackson, I'm going to ask you first. You detected a conflict of interest. What was that conflict exactly? And why did that make you feel so uncomfortable?
So, in the situation that we were trying to display, we had a person that was in control of a large portion of a budget that was being used for the betterment of the entire facility. And that person making the decision had a financial interest in a company that was producing the product. And to add to that, the company wasn't willing to work with us on the pricing, yet it was still being endorsed anyway. And so, and it may have been a great product. Like the key here is that it could have been a legitimate, a good decision. However, the conflict of interest being there in itself would require us to have it cleared from a legal department just to ensure that there isn't any backlash from it.
Thank you. Dr. Kawam, do you believe that the COI was handled appropriately?
So yeah, the conflict of interest was handled appropriately in the sense that it was recognized and a conversation was started among the people who could potentially purchase it, as well as the person who has investments in the company. So it was recognized that there was a conflict of interest, and it's important to note that before ruling out anything, that the situation was recognized and that there was a conversation that was started to discuss it. So in that respect, yes, the situation was handled appropriately.
Thank you. I totally agree with you. Dr. Jackson, back to you. So you made the conflict of interest evident. Are there other ways to mitigate the conflict of interest that might be effective in this case?
Absolutely. I think that it could have been handled in multiple different ways. The choice to voice our concerns with the representative of the company, that was just one way to handle it, just being candid during the conversation. However, we could have waited until the end. We could have waited and said, great, we're going to talk about it and get back to you. That would have been acceptable as well. And even I could have later, before any decisions were made, talk to Dr. Wavelength in private to discuss this. And so there are several ways that it could have been handled, as long as nothing moved forward without it being addressed.
Absolutely. Dr. Kawam, do you see any potential adverse outcomes if the institution had indeed purchased these tests?
Of course, because of the existence of the conflict of interest, it does look a little fishy on the hospital's part, especially the physician who is promoting that they purchased the test and that they have stocks in it. I think that can actually become a huge issue, because certain data might be hidden from the public because of the interest of trying to make a profit. So it can definitely come out with some pretty bad outcomes.
All very legitimate thoughts. And now over to Dr. Crothers.
Well, there are essentially three ways that you can classify conflict of interest, and we're fairly familiar with these. The first is being financial, which we discussed. Second is non-financial, where perhaps the individual is getting intellectual gratification, developing a reputation, developing personal relationships, or even doing political advocacy. And the third is indirectly financial. And sometimes we don't think of these. They may be longitudinal goals that we have, things such as honors and career development, developing a mentor that can help us in the future, and that kind of thing. And you can see that they overlap. And that's actually very common. It's really normal for us to fail to recognize the existence of a conflict of interest. But regardless of how they're classified, conflicts of interest are a moral hazard. They increase our likelihood that we will breach a moral duty, violate a norm of our professional or scientific conduct, or even neglect our fiduciary responsibilities. You know, in some of the psychological tests that have been done, it's been shown that declaring a financial conflict has actually caused that abuse to be perpetuated. So in other words, you know, you've told everybody that you're conflicted, you have stock in X, and that leaves you free essentially to vote in your own self-interest. Even the use of the term potential conflict of interest might be a problem because it makes us feel as if we're off the hook, so to speak. And a conflict of interest always has the potential for harm or for wrongdoing. You know, as humans, we've essentially evolved in order to act in our own best interest as a mechanism of survival. And though our decisions always involve both cognitive and emotional processing, we often minimize the emotional impact and believe that we can behave purely rationally, kind of like Spock, and do the right thing. But that's really not the case. These are intimately intertwined and they can't be separated from each other. Most of the influences and biases that we have are actually unconscious. And again, there are many psychological studies that show that how we predict we'll act in a certain situation to do the right thing is actually different than how we actually act in that conflicted situation. So those are discordant often. And you only need to think about the Milgram experiment where researchers were having a participant shock a person in the other room that they couldn't see every time that they made a wrong answer, and made the questions more and more difficult and the shock doses higher and higher, the voltage. And yet 65% of those individuals continued to shock the person in the room that they couldn't see even after they stopped answering, you know, when they were presumed dead. None of us would assume that we would do that, and yet sometimes we act that way in the actual situation. We also tend to rationalize our own decisions and motives and make them appear more acceptable to others. And that's to obscure our unconscious motivations. So we're victims of self-deception, essentially. We can accept a belief in our own interest, even when unbiased observers might recognize the error of our ways.
Thank you. So now we're going to do another scenario. I will just read it to you, and then we'll have our panel discussion. So Dr. Science formerly worked for a genetic therapeutics company, Brightstar, and currently serves on an advisory board that recommends new genetic therapeutics for public dissemination. He is asked to vote on approval of a therapy that he helped to develop. He receives no royalties. In his past research, he discovered that this Brightstar therapy under review was highly detrimental to the Native Americans. However, he reasons that they are a very small population that are not likely to get the disease in question. So he votes yes to releasing the therapy without any label warnings. That's the scenario, and I'm sure you're all thinking what type of conflict of interest this is. Where do Dr. Science's loyalties and duties lie? And if he were legally bound by a contractual obligation, what we also know as a gag order, not to discuss his prior research with the genetics company, is he then absolved of his conflict of interest? What are some ways to mitigate this conflict of interest? And for the answers, I'm now going to turn to our expert panel. We will start with Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson, what are your thoughts about this situation? Help us to understand it.
This is a great one, and you know, conflicts of interest aren't always as simple as being financial, where you can say yes, they own stock in the company, they're making a decision, so this is wrong. It's not always that black and white. I think this is a perfect example of one of those situations. So you're thinking to yourself, he knows that the research, he's discovered that this new therapy is detrimental to Native Americans. So, you know, all of you are probably thinking, of course, you should say, you know, no, we know that this is a problem. However, you can see that he makes reasons to himself that it's a very small population. He's rationalizing the decision he's about to make. And so, you know, as far as what type of conflict of interest this would be, this is non-financial. This is nothing more than a combination of his morals with him being concerned of violating a legal agreement. And so this is a great topic for discussion. I don't know that there is a clear answer to this. I would have trouble voting yes. But then he's concerned with, you know, with the outcome, what the fallout of this might be. So this might be something that Dr. Science would need to discuss with someone in maybe a legal setting before making this decision.
Totally. Thank you. Dr. Kawam, how might Dr. Science's contractual obligation affect his decision making? Does he have a duty to reveal what he knows about injuries to Native Americans to the advisory committee?
So he is legally contracted to not discuss the data. I'm sorry, not to bring up the issue, but he does have access to the data. So he does know information that can, even though legally he's bound to not discuss this, he can actually talk with other people, like a legal department, in order to make the decision. So technically, yes, he's not supposed to discuss it, but he does have that moral side where he does need to at least present the information in such a way that can bring up this issue without breaking the contract that he signed.
Thank you. This is a very difficult scenario with a lot of the subtleties of conflict of interest played out here. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Crothers. How would you handle this conflict of interest if you were the advisory board chair or if you were Dr. Science, Dr. Crothers?
Yeah, I think that this is very difficult too. And one of the primary difficulties would be in detecting that there's a conflict of interest at all, because if Dr. Science doesn't reveal that he was involved in that research and he knows this little factoid that the rest of the advisory committee should know, then no one's going to be the wiser. And as a chair of a committee, for example, we're responsible to try to make sure that we review the curriculum vitae of all of our members and anticipate any potential conflicts of interest that might arise when we're looking at our agenda before meetings. That's one of the responsibilities we should have. So had I been able to do that as the chair, I might have noticed that he was working for this company and thought to recuse him from the discussion. So that can be a difficult thing because my assessment of this, you know, we have some legal complications, but my assessment of this is that his immediate duty being on that advisory committee is to the public, and that includes Native Americans. So that's a situation where he would have to as well address the conflict within himself and perhaps abstain or recuse himself.
Right. Thank you. I think you echo everybody's thoughts on this panel. Could you take it from here and let's discuss about the unconscious biases impacting conflict of interest, please?
Okay, so here are some of the most common unconscious biases that are employed when we have a conflict of interest. And I think we're all familiar with confirmation bias. That's really seeking information that confirms your own viewpoint or excluding information that you know will be contrary to your viewpoint. So you really only go to one source or a small number of sources, and you never look at the opposing views. Conformity bias is going along with the crowd or groupthink. We get swept up in what's happening and we just kind of vote yes. Affinity bias is very similar, and it's where we align ourselves with the beliefs and opinions of people or groups that have similar beliefs and opinion as our own. And so what this can do is migrate into adopting all of the beliefs instead of each of those beliefs separately. Similarity bias is when you align yourself to someone who's very much like yourself, and that could be based on race or gender or even interests again. And again, it's a feeling that I belong to this group, and so I'm going to believe all of the items that this group believes. Beauty bias and halo effect are interesting because beauty bias we're all familiar with from journalism. They always have very handsome and good-looking people as journalists or TV announcers. And that's because attractive people tend to be trusted and have their opinions favored. And halo effect follows right on with that. It's knowing that someone is generally and basically good. All of your history with them has been positive, and so that everything they say and believe is good and can be believed. The horns effect is just the opposite. And finally, I think it's good to consider contrast effect, and that's the tendency to compare only two options, only the few things that you have available, rather than thinking outside the box. And some people call this the what you see is all there is problem.
Thank you.
I'm going to go into a few strategies for mitigating conflict of interest as well. So we talked a little bit about disclosure already, and unfortunately that doesn't usually work if you look at the studies, because it leaves us with a feeling of moral license to actually behave unethically and even magnify or exaggerate, our advice or vote. And unfortunately, it gives us the false assurance that we're immune from conflict. So another option would be social oversight, and that can also be helpful, but oversight groups themselves may have their own conflicts of interest and a desire to drive the decisions in a certain direction. In some cases, if you're already on the top rung, like the executive board of the ASC, there really is no availability to have an oversight group. Sometimes the public in general serves as that oversight group, and that's a good thing to have as citizens. Although we like to believe that artificial intelligence and mechanical models can provide the best solution in a lot of situations, it's usually not the case. They're usually speculative outcomes that often prove to be incorrect, because things don't work in a real life setting the same way that they do in a research setting. Life and humans are messy after all. And perhaps the only way that we can really ensure the absence of conflict of interest is to completely remove the individual from the discussion and influence through voting and through recusal. Well, this can be difficult because oftentimes when we're getting groups together, we all have conflicts of interest. It's inevitable. It's just part of our makeup. And sometimes the knowledge that we have is critical to the decision-making process. So you may not be able to eliminate that person completely, but what you can do is ask for specific facts, that they be presented, and then when opinions are being viewed or voting is being done, you would have those people recuse themselves. And finally, there's neuropsychologic information, which is what we're doing today with this presentation. We're trying to make everyone aware that conflict of interest is actually inevitable, and we all need to monitor it both in ourselves and in others.
Thank you. If you are interested in discussing some other situations that result in a conflict of interest, our committee has listed other scenarios that you can consider here. For instance, serving on an interview committee and interviewing a friend. And the list goes on. Here further down, you see serving on a consensus work group and advocating for a particular medical guideline that is supported by your lifetime research. or posting your laboratory's diagnostic QA weaknesses on social media, or working part-time at a laboratory that provides a competing test as your full-time employer laboratory or hospital, and providing that laboratory with information from your primary laboratory. So, these are a lot of scenarios that have been put here together by our committee. I would really like to thank Dr. Crothers, Dr. Kawam, and Dr. Jackson for having helped to bring to light and to really dissect out conflict of interest concepts for our participants today. Oftentimes when one is involved with submission of a scientific material for either presentation or publication, we tend to underplay the importance of conflict of interest, and it remains another to-do item or to check off and then move on. So I hope that our discussion today kind of stopped us in our tracks to think a little bit more deeply about conflict of interest. One cannot underscore enough the subtlety with which some of the psychological aspects and our own biases could play out to obscure an inherent conflict of interest. The Ethics and Conduct Committee has worked really hard to put together valuable information and documents that you may access when submitting your presentations and/or abstracts to the American Society of Cytopathology. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we would like to thank you all for your time.
Thank you.